Hey, Tim Frisch with a Frisch Perspective here. Today I want to talk about a topic that is definitely a topic of interest and debate in Bible translation that has to do with gender-inclusive language, and I want to talk about it in relationship to the King James Version. So when I talk about gender inclusiveness in the King James Version, I do say it somewhat in jest. I don't think that the King James translators had an agenda like you see today with Bible translators in some instances. However, I do think there's a lesson to be learned in looking at the King James Version when it comes to the issue of gender language. And so I just hope in this video to kind of get us thinking a little bit more clearly about this and to promote fairness as we assess the issue of how to deal with gender language in Bible translation. But when you look at the definition of gender neutrality or gender inclusiveness in language, kind of a generic definition from Wikipedia here, it says, gender neutral language or gender inclusive language is language that avoids bias towards a particular sex or social gender. In English, this includes use of nouns that are not gender-specific to refer to roles or professions, as well as avoidance of the pronouns he, him, and his to refer to people of unknown or indeterminate gender. When we talk about gender inclusivity today, it does really tie into certain social battles and issues, and I totally understand that, and that's why it can be an issue in Bible translation. But we do need to understand it's really interesting when you look at older translations, using gender neutral language is actually nothing new. And so I want to look at that from the King James Version. But people will attack translations if they use any amount of gender inclusive language. And I would agree that gender inclusiveness can definitely be a problem if it misses or distorts the author's original intent. So what I want to show you here is that, there's a certain amount of flexibility the King James translators used. You could just say, well, you should always be very literal, but actually the King James translators were more flexible in how they translated certain terms in order to just convey generic gender, even though they could have translated it more literally to refer to male gender in every instance. So I think it's really fascinating, but it does really help us to understand this issue or think about it in a more nuanced way. So in Exodus chapter 1, verse 1, we see here in the King James Version on the left, now these are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. Every man in his household came with Jacob. In the American Standard Version, it says, now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came into Egypt. So in this instance, the American Standard Version actually rendered it as sons of Israel rather than children of Israel. The American Standard Version doesn't always do that, but in this instance, they felt contextually like that was the better way to translate it, whereas the King James Version, you just have the generic children. But if you look at Young's literal translation, so this is very literal, you'll see over and over the term is sons of Israel, sons of Israel, sons of Israel, sons of Israel, all over the place. And so you really have that phrase over 590 times in the Old Testament. In the Young's literal translation, it says sons of Israel. So why did the King James translators translate that as children of Israel? Well, I think you can understand the reason is because it's not just talking about male children, it's talking about male and female people. So just to be more generic or inclusive, they use the term children. Completely accurate translation of what was originally intended there, but it is a gender neutral term. And then another example is in the New Testament here. When we look at Galatians 3:26, in the King James Version it says, for ye are all the children of God by faith in Christ Jesus. If you look at that in the American Standard Version, it says, you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. I noticed, too, that in the New King James Version, it also says sons of God there. And I think that's true in other translations that are trying to be literal. It says sons of God in Galatians 3:26. So again, you just see an instance here where the King James translators said, we feel contextually we're going to put children of God, a more generic term. rather than a gender-specific term, sons. But other translations went with sons. Let me give you one more example here. In Philippians 2:3, the King James Version says, "Let nothing be done through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem other better than themselves." In the American Standard Version, it says, "Doing nothing through faction or through vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, each counting other better than himself." So the word each is, one person that it's referring to there. If you use the word each there, it should be himself. That would be more the literal way of rendering it. But the King James there says themselves. Now again, the American Standard Version, the New King James Version, actually does use the term himself. So why did the King James translators put themselves? That generic plural for a singular referent. I think that's really interesting. But the point is they did that because it's not only referring to men esteeming others better than themselves, it's referring to men and women, right? If you're a woman in the church, you're to esteem others better than yourself. So that's how the King James writers chose to translate that as a more generic term, themselves. So why do I point out these examples? A lot of you know that I have a lot of respect for the King James Version, and I have talked about it quite a few times on my channel that I do really like the King James Version in many ways, although I recommend other translations all the time as well. But what I respect about the King James partly is that they weren't so rigid in how they translated things, and this is one example of that. That, they weren't hyper literal. They were willing to be more generic in the way that they used gender language if they felt that it made more sense contextually. On the other hand, they didn't have an agenda to just try to constantly make everything gender inclusive. So I think you can see that there's a balance here, and the King James really shows that. But all that to say, I think we need to be careful about automatically claiming that a translation is liberal theologically if there is some gender-neutral language in it. I do think that there is a line that we can cross where we're no longer just trying to get what the author originally said into our language, and maybe there is an agenda or a philosophy. And I think we see that a lot in our culture. I know that there are battles about gender roles, but I also think that when Paul says brothers, for example, talking to the church, if that's translated as brothers and sisters, I'm not sure I would call that some sort of a liberal bias. I think that is some sort of a gender neutral way of talking that Paul probably actually intended when he said brothers. He meant brothers and sisters. And I think you can see that the King James translators did the same thing to some degree, that if they felt the original author intended male and female, they might use a generic term there. So having some flexibility on gender language is really nothing new. And I thought that would be a really interesting thing to talk about today. And I just really want us to be fair, as I said earlier, in assessing issues like this. I do think that this is an issue we need to be thinking about. We really should be careful about how we translate when it comes to gender. So I totally agree with that side of things. On the other hand, I think we can be maybe unfair in how we look at the situation, and we got to realize that if you were going to be hyper literal with the original language, you would be doing things that translations haven't done even since the time of the King James. And so you can see that in the Young's literal translation, where you just have this hyper literal way of saying the children of Israel, and it just constantly says sons of Israel, sons of Israel. So I just want us to be fair and informed as we think about issues like this. It is important, though, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this kind of thing in the comments below. Please keep things civil and as positive as you can, but I do welcome interaction. So leave your comments and thoughts, and thank you as always for listening to my thoughts brought to you from a Frisch perspective.